All right, on this True Law Stories, we have some crazy, interesting stories. We've talking about a rapper who was shot in the barn and ended up with a $5 million case. We've got the sad state of insurance in Miami. We talk a little bit about that in Miami, Florida. Who's on the stand? Confusion, cracking up a jury, and finally the case of the grave robbing university. All this with David Charlip of the Charlip Law Group. David, say hi.
Hi, how are you, Ian?
I'm great. Thanks for being on, and thank you all for watching True Law Stories. Before we get started, of course, this is brought to you by videocasestory.com. One of the best ways to grow your law practice or grow any business is through your customer stories. If you want to learn exactly how to do it and get some amazing bonuses, go to testimonialbook.com to get the book. And before we get going, don't forget to check out Video Case Story. All right, we've got David on. We're going to talk all about the grave robbing university and other stories. Let's get started. Tell us a little bit about your journey as an attorney. You've been doing it for a few years, huh?
Yes, over 40 years, and for the most part in Florida, although we've handled cases throughout the United States. It's been a very varied practice. We've handled class action cases. We've handled personal injury cases, commercial cases. So I've had a good deal of exposure to all aspects of the law and litigation.
And I always like to know, what made you become an attorney?
It's one of those things where everyone in high school would say, oh, you should be an attorney. You speak or you make good arguments. And so that's what really motivated me to go there. So I took everyone's advice.
And your law offices are in South Florida, correct? In Miami?
Yes, in Miami.
And have you been there in Miami the whole time that you've been practicing law?
I am in the South Florida area, although I've moved around in the Dade County, Broward County area. For a time, I was up in Fort Lauderdale. For a time, I was at a different location in North Miami. But being in South Florida enabled me to practice in South Florida, going from West Palm Beach south.
And the reason I ask is because you've been there that long, you've been practicing that long, and you've seen monumental changes. South Florida is just massively changed in that amount of time. Tell me a little bit how that's changed from your point of view and also just from the legal point of view.
Wow, that's a question I could take probably about 3 hours to answer. To summarize, in Miami, there have been waves of changes. Thinking about where I was when I first was clerking, to the influx of people from Cuba after the Mariel boat lift, to different changes in the Miami business community. Miami started out as a backwater place and has now grown to be really a world-class city with folks coming to live from all over the world. And certainly after the pandemic, there's been a huge migration from California and from New York. Every year, a couple of years, there are different factors that keep driving people to Miami. And most recently, you're seeing news reports of people leaving Miami, most of them long-term Miamians, due to the influx of these new folks and due to the rising prices. There's a lot of volatility right now in Miami.
Oh yeah, it is crazy. It's every time I go down there, it's different roads, different people, more traffic, and it's an interesting place. And you've dealt with obviously a lot of cases. But the first one I want to talk about actually happened here in Central Florida, where I am. Tell me a little bit about this case in Sanford.
He represented a gentleman who was an aspiring rap artist, and he was booked to do, and for lack of a better word, an urban night at a place, a historic bar called The Barn in Sanford. And this was some years ago, and at the end of the evening, he was leaving to go to his car, and he was shot a number of times in the parking area and was lucky to be alive, actually, after the shooting. And we represented him, and we sued the owners of the bar and the owner of the property upon which the bar is based, at least the bar to the then management. as well as a security company. And the case was a difficult case because there were issues with the insurance coverage. There was a question as to the extent to which the injury occurred on the bar premises or on a street separate and away from the bar. There was a contention that the security was above and beyond what was called for, given the fact that the police substation was a half a block away. And there was a contention that this was a quote unquote street beef between two guys that had nothing to do with the bar, just happened to happen where it happened, and that my client was also a shooter in the incident. We didn't receive any kind of settlement. We were forced to try the case, and the Sanford jury, we felt, was not the most sympathetic jury to a young Black male who's being accused of gang-like activity with tattoos all over his body, on his face. And so going in, we felt we had a tough battle to be able to get this very nice gentleman justice. And the jury, when we first did the questioning of the jury, were pretty much all gun owners and pretty much all very law and order. Yet during the trial, we felt like we positioned our client well as someone who cooperated with the police and who was truly a victim of a crime that should never have happened had there been adequate security. And the neat thing about the result of the case was we convinced the jury of our client's righteousness and the fact that the bar owners didn't protect him as they should, that although we asked for something like $2 million, the jury awarded us $5 million. So the result was surprising in a great way. And we ultimately were able to settle the case on a very substantial and good basis for our clients.
So you ended up with a settlement or with a trial, a win at trial?
It was a win at trial, but what happened in this case, because the insurance coverage was insufficient, we ended up with a potential what's called bad faith case against the insurance company, where we say, look, in all reasonableness, you should have settled this case when you had the opportunity to within policy limits. And because they didn't, they exposed their insured to this $5 million excess verdict, which we were able to resolve that for settlement.
That's amazing. That's really interesting. And on that note, real quick, I don't want to get into too far into this, but being in Miami and with everything going on in insurance, what are your thoughts on what's going on in insurance right now in Florida?
It's clear the system is broken. I actually do mediations for the Department of Banking and Finance on insurance disputes. And it's troubling to see how many insureds don't get the kind of offers that they should be getting, and how many situations can't be settled in mediation. And with the rising premiums and with the companies pulling out of Florida, the insureds are not left with many options. And the insurance companies also really don't have a good ability to insure the risks. So these new statutes that have been passed, I think, are going to help to some extent in one way, but it's going to really make the insured's job a lot harder to get paid once they do suffer a loss. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, but I don't have very high expectations that folks are going to be able to fix their houses quickly after a hurricane or after some other adverse event.
No, it's pretty crazy. And on a completely different note, you had an interesting computer theft case. I can't help but laugh about this, but it's pretty interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Some years ago, I represented a computer manufacturer that had a theft at their warehouse. And the theft occurred when someone from the outside broke a wall, went inside and removed boxes of computer equipment. And the insurance company denied the claim and claimed that there were motion detectors inside the warehouse and that those motion detectors should have been set off, and that They felt like the alarm system evidenced the alarm being shut off before this event was called in. So we had an expert that was of Asian descent, Mr. Hu was his name, and he was an engineer. And he testified how easy it was to defeat a motion sensor. And he did some tests by holding up a cardboard in front of him and going into the warehouse. And in trial, we tried to have him reproduce what he did. And the judge was confused because she wanted to know who the expert was. And we said, Mr. Who? She said, who? Yeah, I'm asking about the expert. And we said, well, she said, what's his name? We said, it's who? She said, the expert. Well, what's the expert's name? His name is who? And it went like the old Costello sketch, who's on first, for probably 5 minutes, to the point where the jury was in tears laughing and the judge was totally confounded. And there actually were rumors that the judge liked to warm herself up a little bit at lunchtime. So I don't know whether that played into it at all, but it's a funny thing. And one of my biggest regrets was not asking the court reporter to transcribe that, because it would have been classic.
That would have been something to have framed in your office. That's awesome.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Oh my gosh. I can only imagine being there. Oh, that is amazing. Oh man. And it's crazy to have things like that in the courthouse. How do you, when you're in court, how do you handle that? Because you have to be professional. You can't completely just crack up.
You try not to, but we're all human and it happens. And sometimes it's really good to let off the steam and just realize that although things are serious, nothing is absolutely that serious.
Yeah,
so,
true. Yeah. And it's not,
have a bit here and
yeah. And it's not like anyone died in that case, but obviously there's a lot of tragedy and personal injury. But you had a case too where someone's about bodies disappearing.
Yes, some years back, an associate of mine, young lawyer, had come to me asking for advice about the fact that this gentleman had come to him claiming that unfortunately his wife passed away and he was having trouble receiving her remains after she had been cremated. And he was able to determine that the reason for the delay was the fact that his wife's body had been taken by the company that moves bodies from the funeral home to the crematory. It's called a removal company, to a local university to use as a cadaver at their mortuary school. And so, learning of that, I said to him, you're going to need to give me this case, because I can guarantee you that there's more folks that have been affected like this. This isn't just a one-time thing. And we worked the case together and ended up finding out, of course, that there were hundreds of bodies that had been waylaid in that fashion. And we were able to file a class action and then ultimately bring individual actions against the university and obtain settlements on behalf of a number of folks whose family members their remains were used in that fashion without authorization. Ultimately, the school closed their mortuary department because of it.
Wow. Wow. That is, so the school knew about it and was still doing it.
The school, the mortuary department knew that the bodies were coming from this removal company, but they didn't really pay attention to whether anyone had consented. And they thought the bodies, or they claimed they thought the bodies were these bodies destined for a pauper's grave without any family and without any issue with having their bodies being used for purposes of instruction.
Wow. Wow, that's crazy. These are fascinating stories. I'm sure you've got tons of them over 40 plus years of practice.
Sure.
But David, tell us a little bit about working with you, who you work with, and how to get a hold of you.
My firm is Charlip Law Group in Miami, Florida. We handle cases mostly in the state of Florida, but actually throughout the United States. Currently, we have some cases in Alabama, and I've handled class actions in probably half the states in the United States. And you can reach me in Miami at my offices. My number is 305-354-9313.
All right. And Dave, we'll put a link to that and all that in the show notes. But David, thank you so much for being on True Law Stories. This has been a lot of fun and
Sure.
funny and interesting. And hopefully we get to have you back someday telling more of those stories.
Love to. I've got a bunch.
Yeah, that's awesome. And thank you all for taking David and I on our journey. Make sure to check him out at the Charlip Law Group. And this has been Iron Garlic and True Law Stories.